to listen about the Irish, you're in the right place. Joe's gonna do a little bit of an interview, so you don't just listen to us drone on. And also, we're gonna do a Q&A session. Because the reason why we're here is to find out about your families, and we'll explain why. We use the book as sort of an excuse. We're not really trying to sell books. In fact, all the proceeds of book sales go to Canada Ireland Foundation, which built the Ireland Park in downtown Toronto, and they're building a museum now. And it'll be all about the Irish and what happened during the potato famine. So all the proceeds are going to that. So we're not selling vacuum cleaners or anything. We just want to know about your families, and we'll tell you about your families. That's really what we're all about. So Joe, over to you.
So hi everyone, welcome. As Tom's mentioned, we've been doing this for a while, so we're all just ready to fall asleep. Kevin and Eleanor are obviously here from Ireland. Tom is our Canadian author, so you'll see Tom Jenkins and Kevin Lee, and you'll note the name Jenkins is not Irish, so you'll figure out what he has to do with Ireland at some point soon. So we're going to kick it off by having Kevin explain what Culloden actually is.
The original Culloden estate extended over some 90,000 acres in South County Wicklow and North County Wexford in Ireland. During our darkest days in the famine, 6,000 people were assisted in emigrating to Canada, to Ontario, Quebec and then on to Ontario from the estate. The estate in Wicklow was only a small amount of what the landed property of the Earls Fitzwilliams had. Their home base was in Yorkshire in England. Here they had a massive property, the largest residence in Europe, largest residential holding in Europe, and tremendous wealth generated from the mining of coal in Yorkshire and steel. You must remember that the Irish famine coincided with the pipeline of the Industrial Revolution in England, so they were very, very wealthy, and as such they were able to take the hit. Unlike other Irish landlords who, with the Irish famine, they found themselves cash strapped. They were losing out on their income from Ireland, and they were dependent on their.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but the back row can't hear, so can we use the
Okay.
microphone?
All right, sure, yeah.
Sure. Or the back row could move up. Sure, you're at church, you know. Because sometimes the speakers are not very.
Any room up front here.
Would you like to come up to the front here? We can put our chairs in the back, because we're trying to avoid using microphones if you can. Well, we'll do it if you want us to, but we prefer not to.
It's hard to hear even here.
Test.
It could be my ears.
So, can you hear me when I'm talking?
Pardon?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can't hear him because he's soft spoken.
Stop.
Okay, you get the microphone.
Now, can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
All right, there you
Right,
go.
we talked about Culloden estate. We'll just recap on it. 85,000 acres in Ireland. It's more of a summer residence than anything else. It was the home to which they came in Ireland at hunting season and shooting season, and to play cricket, and to entertain British politicians and nobility coming across from England. As we said, as you may have heard, Earl Fitzwilliam was one of Europe's richest people at the time, deriving his income from coal mining and steel mining. He had many thousand tenants on his Irish estate who, when the potato crop failed in 1845 and again in 1846 and again in 1847, found themselves at death's door because they relied entirely on the potato crop to stay alive. Breakfast for potato breakfast, potato dinner and potato supper. The average Irishman ate 14 pounds of potatoes in one day. Now, it was a very healthy food, and visitors to Ireland remarked on how healthy looking Irish children were because they were well fed on all the nutrients that potatoes offered. Unfortunately, when it failed, there was no alternative. Initially, the Earl did buy flour from Rouen we suddenly discovered that people couldn't break bread. They had no utensils, they didn't know, they hadn't the culture of baking bread, they had to rely on potatoes and nothing else. So the flour had to be taken to the Dublin market, sold, and in its place they bought rice, which is easy to cook, so it did ease matters somewhat. But the main solution, the main solution of the fifth Earl Fitzwilliam was to assist the tenants in emigrating to Ontario. Now, many a time I've seen the misnomer of eviction being used. This wasn't eviction, it was the preferred option of the Irish tenant farmers on the Collatin estate. People clamoured to get on the list to go to Canada. They were given assistance to go, and they would have 5, 10, maybe 50 acres of land which they would own in Canada. They might have a quarter of an acre, half an acre, or maybe even an acre if they were lucky in County Wicklow, which they would never ever own, no matter how hard they worked on it. So it wasn't very much a desirable option, and to enable the tenants to emigrate, they were given their passage to Quebec. Ticket was paid for them on board William Gray's ships from New Ross. They were given a food allowance, mainly of oatmeal and rice, which they packed up and they brought with them. They were given a handcrafted, skillfully crafted sea chest in which to bring their few belongings with them. There's a bit of an irony about this, because the sea chests were made from Canadian pine. The ships came one direction from Quebec to New Ross with the pine and with the loads of timber, which was milled at places like the sawmill in Collatin. On the return journey, they were, prior to the famine, they had used rock ballast to keep the boat afloat and keep it sailing the way it should be sailing. Now, instead of rock ballast, they use human ballast, and 300, 400, often over 500 emigrants were packed onto the ships to sail from New Ross. It wasn't very pleasant. First of all, they had to find their way to New Ross. Many of them walked the full distance. It took 2 days, 60 miles to go to New Ross. You must remember, these were country people. They lived in a subsistence economy. They would have never seen a shop, they would have never seen a retail outlet, they would have never seen the sea. They were humble, simple people coming from the foothills of the Wicklow Mountains, and it was very much a daunting voyage that lay ahead of them. They were crowded into the holds of the ship, which had, on their journey from Quebec, initially had brought timber. Now the hastily made bunk beds were installed down below on the boats, and very often an Atlantic storm would rage for days on end, and they wouldn't be allowed up on deck. They would have to stay below deck with nothing, only maybe a hard sea biscuit to chew on. They couldn't go up above to cook any meals for themselves. It was quite a terrible voyage. A lot of sickness, a lot of illness, a lot of vomit, a lot of human excrement, a lot of disease. We don't want to go into the detail, but you can imagine a crowd of 400 or 500 on a very, very small sailing vessel crossing the Atlantic. So basically, that's what we're talking about today. That's what the shoebox people tells the story of 50 families who left Collatin. It tells of where they left in Ireland and where they settled in Canada, and most importantly, how some of you, including people like Mary Beth, found their way back to Collatin.
Okay, so Kevin, you're an Irish historian. Tom, where do you fit into all this? How did you first trip onto this journey?
So I'll try to do this without, I was taught many years ago as a young officer at Trenton how to talk to a very large parade square, so hopefully I'll still be able to do it. If you can't hear me, I'll put the microphone on. Are you okay? You all hear me? Okay. So here's the Canadian version of what you just heard. Collatin. Who knows Collatin? Nobody knows Collatin. In Canada, we can't even spell Collatin. But what it was the Hudson's Bay of Ireland. That we know. Hudson's Bay was set up by the British to run Canada, long before Canada was a country. And the British set these up all over the world. East India Company, the Virginia Company, And of course, the Americans revolted and all those companies went away. Well, what happened in Ireland is it was Culloden. There were a dozen of them, and they were administered by the lords and the earls, the landed gentry. That's how the Brits ran it. They had a ruling class. You know, it's, I guess, in some ways not unlike all the stuff you read about in the tabloids now about Harry and William and all that stuff, but they had a ruling class, and the ruling class administered on behalf of the king or the queen, whoever. So in Ireland, they had the same setup. Now, Hudson's Bay in Canada, today we know it as a store, as, you know, just a store. But back 400 years ago, it was everything. It was transportation, it was production, it was everything. Big corporation. So Culloden, no different. So the reason why Kevin has so much information is the corporate records of a 400-year-old corporation where all these Wicklow families came from. And there were about 500 that left during the famine, and we've been able to find 50. And the reason why we went on this tour is we want to find the other 450. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But why is the book called Shoeboxes? What's the Canadian version of what Kevin just told us about? Well, you know, as a young man, I would listen to my mom and my granny tell me about my history. Most of it I ignored because I was a young man starting off my career. And about 5 years ago, by happenstance, I started getting interested in it. But all I knew was that my family had come from Ireland during the famine, and that all the children died on the voyage, and that they had more children in Canada. That's all, that part registered. Everything else, didn't remember. So about a year before the famine, before COVID wasn't the famine, a year before COVID, I found myself in London, England, because I was on my way over to Berlin to give a speech. And I like to take my wife on business trips, because that way I stay married. And so, but to bring her on a business trip, I usually have to bribe her. So the bribe this time round was that she would get to go to the Champs-Elysees in Paris for a couple days shopping and enjoying herself, etc. Except we open up the newspaper one morning before we're getting on the flight, and France is having a strike. Now I'm telling you all this detail because I want you to know how random and how lucky it was that I found out what I'm about to tell you. Now, so France got a strike. My wife's been in France when there's been a strike. You don't want to go to France in a strike. So we said, well, that's off. So on the spur of the moment, I said to her, why don't we go to Ireland? I think I've got family there. And you know, what else is she's going to say? She's already over in London. She wants to kill time. It's just fine. So on the way in the taxi to Heathrow Airport, I text my 3 sisters. I figured my sisters will know where we're from, because they usually pay more attention. And my little sister, she texted back and said, well, we're Kennedys and we're Walls, and you should go to Galway, because that's where John F. Kennedy went when he visited Ireland. So we get a car, and what I'm about to tell you, we went all the way over to Galway, and it's sort of like landing in Pearson, driving out to Windsor, and then finding your way back to Belleville. That's how dumb this was. So I'm trying to give you a sense of how random and how dumb this was. So I'm in Galway, and they look at me and they say, Kennedy? Well, all your people are from the other side of the island. They're not here. So my wife is now really mad. So I call my middle sister, and I say, is there anything more you can tell me? And she said, look for Mary Byrne in Wicklow. Okay, now I got a name, and I got a place. So I go to Wicklow. I go see the parish priest, the oldest church in the middle of Wicklow, walk in and say, Father, I'd like to find Mary Byrne. He looks at me and he says, which one? There were hundreds of them. So that wasn't going to work out too well. So then I called my older sister, Susan. And I said, Susan, my my sister June told me to find Mary Byrne. She says, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, how do I do that? Well, I have her phone number. So, it's a true story. So then I call up this number, and a woman answered, and it was Nancy Byrne that answered. And Nancy Byrne then says to me, yeah, that's my mom. She don't have a phone. And I said, well, can I come see you? She says, no, I'm working. You know, Canadians, when they go over to Ireland, they expect the Irish to drop whatever they're doing and tell us where we're from. I mean, the Irish are used to Canadians and Americans doing that. So the woman says, well, why don't you just go see my mom? And I said, okay. Where is she? She's 1 mile past the town marker for Shillelagh. And Shillelagh is in Wicklow, but it's up in the mountains. So I drive from Wicklow to Shillelagh, and my wife the whole time is white knuckles on all these little green roads and whatever. And so we get to Shillelagh, we go a mile past, can't find it. So I called the poor woman up, Nancy, and I said, I can't find it. She said, no, it's 1 mile. Go back to the town marker, and it's 1 mile. So I do that. And I go, and quite frankly, I had passed it before, because in Canada, from a farm point of view, we would have considered it a shed. So I stopped, a well-kept shed, but a shed. And so I stopped right at the 1 mile. I looked at my wife, and I said, well, let's go knock on the door. So we go knock on the door of what we thought was a maintenance tool shed kind of deal. And a woman answers, opens the door, and her picture's in here. And it's like meeting Mrs. Santa Claus. Cutest thing you'd ever want to see. 4 foot, maybe 6 inches if she was anything. And it was Mary Byrne. And she looks up at me and she says, Tommy, we've been waiting for you. And now, first of all, nobody's called me Tommy in 40 years. And I'm thinking, boy, that's a familiar tone to take. And when she said, we've been waiting for you, she wasn't talking about the 10 minutes since the phone call. She was talking about decades. She'd been waiting decades. I didn't know this woman. My sister had told me about it, the day before. So we go in, and you got to understand, when you go visit the Irish, we're sitting there in her sitting room, and it's as big as this table. So there's 2 of us, and of course, the moment we go in, we get scones and tea and what have you, and I'm sitting balanced in a cup of tea and a freshly baked scone on both knees. My wife's doing the same, and she's sitting in a chair across from us, and she said, would you like to know about them? And I don't know who she's talking about. She stands up, reaches above the mantle, and pulls down a shoebox. And in that shoebox is 200 years of my family history. All in a shoebox. So I went from 0 knowledge to more information than I ever knew about my Canadian family, and then later my Irish family. I had no idea. She's pulling out of this shoebox letters that were 120, 150 years old. And I could tell from some of their handwriting, it was my granny. It was my granny, I could tell. And what it was is they were pen pals that were sending notes back and forth. And so my wife's wondering what the heck is going on here. She's from Ukraine, and she's sitting there going, yeah, we don't do that back in Ukraine, right? So I'm sitting there, and as she goes deeper into the shoebox, she pulls out my photo, and then she pulls out my wife's photo, and then she pulls out our children's photo. And at this point, we're going, holy smokes, my wife's feeling really creeped out. But it's this little old granny, like you can't be threatened by this woman, a lovely woman. And my wife's very uncomfortable. All this stuff in this farmhouse in the middle of Ireland. And we said to her, how are we related? Because her last name was Byrne, my last name was Jenkins, but I knew that my family in our Pioneer Cemetery were Walls, so I knew that much. And we're buried, and I also thought I was from Hamilton, because we're buried 6 deep in the Pioneer Cemetery out on the bluff above Hamilton Harbor. And I knew it was Wall. And I said, so how are we related? She says, I don't know. Here she is with 200 years of my family, knows more about my family, and she doesn't know how we're related. And I said, well, what are we gonna do about that? She says, well, we have to go see the headmaster. And I said, well, where's that? And she said, well, it's just down the lane in Carnew, which is another little town down the lane. And so we go, and we go to a house just outside of Carnew, and she barges into this house because she knows everybody. She lived her whole life in this small area, and it turned out that this was Kevin and Eleanor Lee's house because Kevin was the headmaster of the school, and all her children and her grandchildren Kevin had taught and Eleanor had taught, so they knew each other. We walk in and they're having lunch, and like my wife's like really not comfortable. You're barging into people's houses and what have you. And Kevin says to me, oh, hi, how are you? And he says, your name? And I said, Tom Jenkins. And he says, who's your ancestors? And I said, William Wall and Ann Wall, because I knew that from the Pioneer Cemetery. And he said, well, we're having a bit of tea right now. Would you mind coming back in 45 minutes? Now, that was his ruse. I didn't know that he was actually going to eat his tea or not eat his tea, etc. But we go back out to the driveway. But Mary Byrne was not done. Mary Byrne didn't skip a beat. She then looks up at us and says, would you like to go see them? It's like, see who? Gets in the car, and we go up into the mountain. And we go above the valley, because all these towns are in the valley, and we go up into the mountains. It's all rolling, and they call it mountains. We call it foothills or escarpment or whatever. So we go 800, 900 feet up. And it's absolutely breathtakingly gorgeous. It wasn't raining, there you go. It was green hills, blue sky, it's gorgeous, gorgeous country. And we go on what was right out of a Hollywood movie set, because it was an abandoned village. And you could tell there'd been a church there, a school, houses. What we didn't know is it was sacked by the British during the rebellion that the Irish had. After the Americans rebelled, the Irish rebelled, except the Royal Navy needed 6 weeks to get over to America. They needed 6 hours to get to Ireland. So that rebellion was crushed. And when they crushed it, they destroyed the villages of the rebellion. And this was called Kilquiggan. And in Kilquiggan, there was a cemetery of the original village. And we go to the very back of the churchyard, and it's an ancient cemetery. And thank God it was the middle of the day, because it was the spookiest thing. There were 6-foot-high grass, and there were tombstones everywhere. And when you walk through an old graveyard, we don't have graveyards like this in Canada. After many centuries, the bodies and the caskets move around, right? And so like you're walking, headstones falling. My wife is like really uncomfortable now. And there's Mary Byrne parting through the grass, going right to the very back. And in the very back is a headstone that's got 16th century, 17th century, 18th century names on it. So hundreds and hundreds of years. And it says, James O'Loughlin, John O'Loughlin, Mary O'Loughlin, Ellen O'Loughlin. And you know, it's pretty amazing. And she goes, that's my grandfather. And I thought, okay, that's pretty good. Except, you know, being Canadian, I don't want to say anything, but what's that got to do with me? Those are O'Loughlin. I have no idea what you're talking about. And so we come back out, and I say, but how are we related? Oh no, the headmaster will tell us. So we go back, and in 45 minutes, he figured the whole thing out. So here I am, randomly going to Ireland, randomly going to see someone I never knew existed. Now it turns out later, I find out that one of my cousins had kept up the pen pal. But as with you, I come from a really big Irish family. And so I had no idea what one cousin was doing, etc. But they would take the family photos and give an update of whatever was going on. So Kevin's looking at me like the, you know, the cat that caught the mouse kind of thing. And and he basically said, here's the ship's manifest. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, here it is, 1849, William and Anne Wall de Bridgeton left New Ross for Gros Isle, Quebec. And it had the names of the children, but it had a passage written in the margin that was gold. And the passage said, William would like permission to bring his brother-in-law, Dennis O'Loughlin, and his sister-in-law, Mary O'Loughlin. Now, it's the stuff like that that allows you to solve riddles. Because then what became very clear as we dug into it, that my granny's granny, Anne Wall, was actually Anne O'Loughlin. And she was the sister of James O'Loughlin, who was buried in that cemetery. And then it all made sense. All the puzzle pieces came together. Mary Byrne knew how I was her cousin and all my other cousins and what have you. And it all made sense. And Kevin solved that in 45 minutes. And that's because he's got access to corporate records.
So let's get Kevin to comment on that. So these corporate records for Culatin, where do you find them? Where do you look at them?
Well, we're blessed to have them in such detail. I was a school teacher all my life, but I can shout, but my voice is not the best for shouting at the moment. The Culatin records are stored in the National Library of Ireland in Kildare Street in Dublin, and also in the National Archives in Sheffield in the UK. Probably the most complete set of records for any estate, not only in Ireland but in Europe. For example, if somebody approaches me, and many people have approached me over the years from men from this area in Ontario, the first thing I'll do is check the maps for 1842. Estate maps were prepared in 1842 for the entire estate on a scale of 12 inches to 1 mile. Every plot of land was numbered, every holding was colour-coded, every house was shown in a beautiful shade of cerise pink, and an index was provided. So in most cases we can identify the very piece of land, the very house that people left when they set off for New Ross during the famine years to board the ships we were talking about. Not only that, but in 1827, 1839, 1848, 1850 and 1860 and 1868, the estate carried out what you could call a census. Every family on the estate was catalogued, the name of the man of the house and what his profession was, the name of the wife, the names of the children, how much land he had, who was the over-tenant, who he held the land from, and most remarkably, there's a little column at one side for further remarks, and that contains wonderful information on a lot of families. For example, this man's house is dirty on the inside, but he keeps it well on the outside, or this man is having an affair with his neighbour's wife, or tittle-tattle like that. A lot of that crept in as well with the people who were recording the names of the people on the estate. Thirdly, you have the immigration records. During the famine years, every family that was assisted emigrating in the years 1846 to 1854 were classified. We know the townland from which they came. We know the names of the parents, and we know the names and ages of all the children. And normally we were given the name of the ship on which they travelled as well. And we are told whether or not they got a wooden chest from the estate. These chests were crafted in Canadian pine and were given to the people to put their humble belongings into when they were travelling to the Ross aboard ship. But the records are very, very complete. And if you go to the famine immigration book, find the family, find the names of the parents, find the names of the children, and then go to the 1861 Canadian census, you will find that same family. Now, a couple of the children might be missing, having died on the voyage, or having died like Tom's ancestral family. They lost 3 children en route. Kingston was very, very important for the people going from Culatin. It was a kind of a gathering point, and they moved from Kingston to Centreville, Tweed, and all the little towns that are scattered in the hinterland of Kingston. There was a reason why they came here, that a lot of our Culatin folk had had arrived here to give their labour and very often give their lives in constructing the Rideau Canal between 1820s and the early 1930s. And many of them succumbed to malaria and are buried in communal graves along the sides of the canal. But yeah, Kingston was very, very important. The majority of our emigrants would have funneled their way through Kingston. Now, it took about 10 days to get from Quebec or Montreal to Kingston. 10 days is important because that's the incubation period for both typhus and cholera, the two most prevalent famine diseases. And what happened is many of our kinfolk and folk travelling from Wicklow died on the Park side. They're buried near the monument on the Park side in Kingston. That's where they found their final resting place.
Okay, so Kevin, in terms of the current book, there's 51 families in it. Is the plan is to try to find more families and develop more shoeboxes. How many do you think you found so far? And are you looking for all of them?
Yeah, we have catalogued 50 shoeboxes here, 50 families. We've tried to tell the complete story. We tried to identify the exact place from which they left, their journey into Ontario, the exact place in which they finally settled, and thirdly, how they found their way back to Culleton. When you talk about the shoebox, we generally have to have a story, and something maybe different about each family. We had 50 for that. When we came here 16 days ago, we had 35 for shoeboxes, which we knew we could write up to make a second book, a sequel. I'd say after our 16 days here now, we have close on 100 new shoeboxes. So there will be one, if not more, shoebox books coming down the line. And our aim is to get as many as possible of those 487 families that came here, to get them identified and reunite them with their roots, either through email or through contact over the internet. And maybe someday they might be able to visit us in Culleton, and we might be able to bring them to their ancestral homeland and set foot upon and walk upon the land that family last walked on some 180 years ago.
Very good. So Tom, tell us how many people from Culleton, like how many descendants do you think there are, and what are kind of the next steps for this group of people?
Okay, so Canadian version of what he said first. The day after he takes me out, not only had he found my family, I was still skeptical, and I asked my sister to go on out to Holy Cemetery and find the names of the 3 children, because I now knew the names of the 3 children, because the manifest I still wanted to see. So she goes out there, and for some reason, scratches away at the grass underneath the main monument to our family, and they're all buried six deep in a pioneer cemetery, and don't you know, she finds a patch of grass that we had walked on for decades, and it had all 3 children's names in granite in the grass. So then I went, okay, he probably has figured this out. The coincidences are too many at that point. But then he blows me away. He takes me to the farmhouse where my family lived, because it's all still there. Your farmhouses where your ancestors left, they're still there. It's frozen in time, because it's all farming country. You know, we have the same here, except when an old farm, like a barn, goes down here, well, the only thing that's left, not the wood, it's the stone. Well, they built all their farmhouses out of stone. So they're all still there. Some of the roofs have caved in, or they put cattle in, or horses, or whatever, but they're all still there.
And who owns it?
So this is an interesting point. They own it. They being, about 100 years ago, the Irish government, well, actually the British government before Ireland became a republic, mandated that all the lords had to give the land to the people that had been on that land for centuries. So, yeah, but the reason why they left on the famine, though, is because they couldn't own land. No matter how hard you work, that's what Kevin had said before. They get here, and my family was given 5 acres and told that if you put a house up and the government agent came back in the spring and you were still alive and you had a house, you got to own it.
So the government in Ireland owns this land?
No,
or- and-
no, today, it's owned by your family, your members of your family.
Ah,
That's who owns it. So
we
so
don't
what
know.
happened is, I've gone back and there are members of my family that own. So what happened is I looked at Kevin and I said, this is not the first time you've done this. And, cause he did it so fast. And I said, are there other shoeboxes? And he says, oh yeah. And at the time, he figured there was about 30. And so over COVID, we went and did the research and found 50. And we said to ourselves, well look, why don't we put it in a book? Why don't we come to Canada, tell this story, and maybe we can find the other 450. Because if you can find all the families, what happens is all these families intermarry. So if you start tracking the tree of one family, you learn a ton about the other family. So if your last name is Kelly, Murphy, O'Toole, Cairn, you know, Byrne, Cassidy, so there's so many Burns and Cassidy. But if your name is that name, you're intermarried with the Murphys and the Kellys and what have you. And what happens is you can find your roots by integrating and learning from each other. Because that's what we found, is that we learned a lot from the other families, because they all through this tour, we've had people come with photos of the same people in this book, but in different photos. We've had people come where one side is a cousin of someone over here and they never met before. You know, there's a lot of interconnection. So to answer Joe's question, we started to, I'm a tech guy, so I'm a computer science engineer. And so we started analyzing all these databases, and it blew us away. We estimate that out of those 6,000 people, 500 families that came here in the 1840s, there's between 200 and 400,000 in Ontario. Because remember, 8 children, then had 8 children, and you know, like, I mean, my family's huge. And when you look at the family trees, they're huge. So we thought, okay, let's go on a little book tour around here and invite half a dozen people. Everywhere we've gone, it's like this, 20 people show up. In Durham, we were supposed to meet 10 people, we had 100 for dinner. You know, like that's what's gone on. Tweed, it was unbelievable. So, and the reason why we're late is there's so many damn people in Kingston, right? So basically we believe that there's hundreds of thousands. Now the thing is though, I'm sort of, one of the reasons why I want to do this, and I hope it's the same reason for you, at some point my children and my grandchildren are going to get interested in this, just like I did. I want to leave enough breadcrumbs that they can actually find it. Because right now, you know, my kids, you know, they're like me, they won't be very interested, but one day they will be. And if we have books and websites and lots of families that came across together telling each other's story, and you can start putting this into museums and what have you, then there's a fighting chance. The reason why, and again, I'm an engineer, he's a teacher, we're not politicians, we're not social media people that have opinions on all this, but the reality is, 180 years ago, when the Irish came here, think of Toronto. Toronto had 38,000 people in 1845. By 1850, it had 100,000, and it was all Irish. So can you imagine the people of Toronto? If all of a sudden we said, hey, guess what? Next year, there's 5 million of you right now. Next year, we're gonna bring 5 million, fill in the blank from where, you know, Ukraine, Syria, Vietnam, whatever. How would you feel about that? You wouldn't be very happy. So at the front of the book there, we talk about the fact that back in those days, they would say no Irish need not apply, we've got all the signs there. The Irish were ostracized because there were too many of them. And they were bringing cholera and typhus, etc., right? But what happened is that over time, the Irish became Canada because there were so many of them. And when you go to Ireland, you'll see a lot of the things the Americans say are very Canadian. Well, we got it from the Irish, for sure. Just the same way, you know, the way to get a Canadian to say sorry is you step on their foot, right? And then say sorry to you. Well, it's the same thing in Ireland. They have the same sort of way about them. So, you know, to at least explain to our children and our grandchildren our background, because quite frankly, our ancestors were told, stop saying you're Irish, stop doing whatever it is that makes you Irish, and for good reason. The Irish were killing each other over in Ireland, and they didn't want everybody killing each other here. And the British just wanted them to shut up and speak English and do whatever jobs they wanted. And but the opportunity here, though, was the Irish became wealthy because the Irish were allowed to own the land, work the land. And remember, Ontario was agrarian until World War II. Ontario was all about farming, and so the Irish did well. But we don't have our history. You know, that's why I told you that story at the beginning, how random that was that I could find my family background. We're trying to make it so that it's real easy, at least for these 400,000 or 200,000, whatever it turns out to be, people from Ontario. Because the reality is that if you're from another part of Ireland, you're out of luck, because there isn't that much detail. And the last thing I'll say about the 200, 400,000, whatever it is, when you try and do it from here, he told you the story of doing it from Ireland coming here. When you try and do it from here, you can't. Because when you get to the census of 1861 or whatever, and you go read, like in my case, William Wall, Ann Wall, I see them in the census. Guess what it says? Born, Ireland. Didn't tell you where. It's like Mary Byrne all over again. You show up in Ireland, you say, I'm here, where's my family from? Well, we need more detail than that. And you see what was happening is the people that were writing the census and the government people, it would be, you know, it's irrelevant, right? You know, you'd say, oh, that one's from Germany, that one's from France, that one's from wherever. They wouldn't write that they're from Wicklow or Cork or Tipperary. And what happened though, is in about 5% of the database was done by Irish people, and they knew where Wicklow was and where Cork was. So 5% of the people from Wicklow, if they did Ancestry.com and all that stuff, could at least get themselves into the right county. But that's why you can't do it. Unless your family kept up for 200 years, you can't find that out, and that's why we did this.
Right, so we should open it up for questions from the crowd.
So, our family's from Sligo. Is it correct to say that most of Ireland wasn't an estate with records, etc.? We never heard of our people coming from an estate or anything like that.
Yeah, you came from Sligo, so the likelihood is that you came from the estate of Lord Palmerston. Lord Palmerston was an English Prime Minister during the famine years, and he was a member of the British Whig Party, would have been a close ally and supporter of Earl Fitzwilliam. The two of them would have been in cahoots because they were both in the same party in British Parliament. Now, a certain amount has been written about the immigrants from the Palmerston estate, and if you contact me later, I'll put you in touch with some really both online or where you can read about the Palmerston estate. But I would warn that the records for the Palmerston records would not be a patch on the Latin records, so it'll be fairly speculative what you can come up with. But hopefully, if we can narrow it down to the Palmerston estate and name it down with your family name, with whatever it was, we might be able to delve into the Catholic records that presume the word Catholic records or Anglican records. Catholic, what religion would you have? Catholic. So it might be possible to go to the Catholic registers and find your family there. But if you do get in touch with me, I promise I will get back to guide you on any direction that I can or point you in the right direction. But we cannot give you the same detail as they had on the Latin estate.
One of the things that went on was it was quite normal to burn the records. First of all, like when burn down the big houses and stuff.
Yeah.
But also as an estate closed, you're looking at like rooms full of records and
Yeah.
just chuck them, right?
And in fairness, the Palmerston records are quite good. In Culleton we had an English agent, normally a Yorkshire-born agent looking after the estate in Ireland. And Lord Palmerston estate, they engaged a professional agency in Dublin called Kincaid, who wasn't directly employed, but he was a kind of an agency who would look after the estate. So the records for the Palmerston estate have, in quite an amount of detail, have turned up in recent years, and I can point you in the direction of some books that you can read on that, which might be of a big assistance to you.
Next question. Yes.
So
Sorry.
Fitzwilliam, when he assisted immigration, did he do that in the 1820s also, 1819, 1820?
The first assisted program was in 1832, and you have that beautiful little prayer book,
Yeah, yeah.
and Joe Dunn's prayer book, and
So what about the carols then, Kevin? You know, I talked to you about that before.
Yeah.
And I know you said they had to get out of there,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
of their history.
yeah, well, the carols were,
So how would they have gotten here? They wouldn't have any money.
the carols were quite creative in getting money for themselves, yeah. And they were
But
quite
you've got in the
very,
book, I noticed
they
in the
were
book.
very creative in cheating, his lordship out of some of his money as well, so the carols would have been grafters, like they would have had money.
But you raise a really good point everybody should be aware of. I thought it was from Hamilton. I'm not. I'm from Camden East. I'm from Kingston. And the reason why it's chain migration,
Yes.
because what happens is part of my family came out over in the 1820s. And what happened is they landed with all their neighbors in Camden East, settled there for a while, lost all their children, and then moved to Hamilton to join other family members. And so you can trace all this, because what happened to the Wicklow Irish is they landed, went close somewhere near Kingston, and then moved on.
Yeah. There are 16 Carroll families in the
Oh,
Michigan.
yeah, and,
But a lot of them went to Humboldt, California. Like they immigrated to the States, went down to the
Yeah.
States.
we were in Tweed yesterday, we found quite a few Carroll connections, might be of interest to you, Maureen, as well. But your Carroll family, they were, as I say, quite inventive. They held a farm, a small farm in Hillbrook, and they moved on to where your farm was in Killabeg, and they found a way of making money. They got the land, I'm not sure the size of the farm, but they sublet it to other tenants. And there were, if you went up the rent that the Carrolls were getting for the land, was far more than he was paying to Earl Fitzwilliam, so he was making a nice little profit out of it, doing no work on the land, but charging others for their work.
I never found any records of them though, in these records that you recommended, anywhere, of the Carrolls. Like the early Carrolls.
Yeah,
Matthew I found.
yeah. Difficult the earlier ones, but from the 1830s on, I can send you all the excerpts from the memorandum books.
Yeah.
Now the memorandum books are interesting because, as I said, the Fitzwilliams were absentee landlords. They returned in the autumn, and in the meantime, before they returned, the agent at Culleton kept a memorandum book, and a tenant wanted a new roof on the house, if he wanted to drain his land or wanted a bit of money for something, he would go to the agent and apply. The agent would write it into the memorandum book. He wasn't empowered to give a decision on it. And when the lordship came over, he took over, he would go through the memorandum books, and at the end of each request, in red writing, are the words of Earl Fitzwilliam: granted, not granted, or whatever. But
What Kevin's talking about is very important. You can't find that on Ancestry.com or any census. And so the Wicklow Irish are the luckiest Irish, because they actually have all these records that
But
did
if
not
yours
get
came over in
burned
the
down.
1820s also, they wouldn't have been assisted.
the families who left in the 1820s would not have been assisted.
No.
The majority of those who came in the 1820s were Protestant Anglican families who were afraid that activities of the 1798 rebellion would flare up again and that they would be burned out of their homes. So the first opportunity they had to get out, they got out, and they gathered up a bit of money they had, sold their stock, and came in into great.
So knowing context matters. My family that came over, Anne Wall and William Wall, they were Romeo and Juliet. Because one was Irish Protestant, Church of Ireland, and one was a Catholic peasant. And he was the owner of the so-called head tenant. He had lots of money and they didn't need to leave for the famine. They left because he found out that all their children, the ones that died, were baptized both in the Church of Ireland and in the Catholic Church. That's like, the reason why he moved to Hamilton after they lost the kids is because his father and his mother had immigrated earlier because they were yeomanry. They were part of the ones that were like a civilian militia that had put down the rebellion. All those houses were burned down by the Irish who were not happy with them. So like you've got to remember the religious strife, the tribal thing going on. That's why there's different waves within the Irish. Other questions?
In the meantime, Maureen, when I get back, we'll reopen the file again on Joe Dunn and the Hinches and your family. Maybe there's information we had now. It's a few years, I think, to be correspondent, is it? Probably 2, 3. It's quite a while ago. I'm not sure if it's a good while ago, but yeah, we'll reopen and have another look at it and see if we can tease out the earlier carols that left in 1820 or before then.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned you were intrigued yesterday.
Yes, ma'am.
When you found the Cassidys, they were involved in this?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, you gotta understand, like, the Cassidys are thick as thieves around. Same with the Murphy.
Careful what you say.
No kidding, they're very, very, I know Russ Cassidy ran us around.
Okay.
And so Russ, oh yeah, and that maybe brings us to another thing that we wanted to let everybody know, because we've been talking to Russ about it. This was a research trip to find out if there was a there, and there is a there. And so what we're gonna do, last summer, we ran a famine school. Kevin and Eleanor organized it, and a bunch of us went over from Canada. There was about 50 of us, and there was about 600 Irish. And they had a school, they had lectures, they had tours, they even had what they call a pageant, they had a play. And the whole 9 yards, all around the Culloden House, etc. Now, we can't move 400,000 people at Wicklow, but what we decided to do is we've gone around to all the towns, and we discovered two things. All the pioneer villages, they're not pioneer villages, those are Irish villages. And they're all built by our families. It's just that they were called pioneer villages because they were trying to not talk about the Irish. So what we found is there's a dozen of them. And some of them, I'm sure all of you have been to. And they're set up to host large groups for weddings and what have you. So what we're gonna do this summer, for 2 weeks in August, we're gonna invite people to do family reunions. And we're gonna organize Wicklow family reunions, all along the 401, all along Highway 10, and all along Highway 7, which is where all of us have been the last 2 weeks. Whether it's Tweed and the Lang Pioneer Village, or Upper Canada Pioneer Village, or Black Creek, there's a dozen of them. So what we're gonna do, and one of the reasons why we did all this, is we're gonna work with people within each family, because me calling a Cassidy, they're gonna go, who the heck are you, right? I gotta have a Cassidy call a Cassidy, and a Kelly call a Kelly, right? That kind of thing. So that's what we're gonna do this summer. And we'll probably have, a lot. We've seen 2,000 people on this trip. We'll probably see upwards of 5,000 to 10,000. And what we're hoping to do is do this, except on the whole day. And you'll get contacted about it. But we're not selling vacuum cleaners. We're hopefully gathering information.
Before we finish up, there are a few people I'd like to say thanks to. Thanks to Mary Beth for coming to us in September, and it was a pleasure having you and so many others with us. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank the man on my left here, Tom Jenkins. The day he drove into my yard with his beloved wife Toby was a seminal day for me. If it wasn't for Tom Jenkins, a lot of the material I've accumulated over the years, either on storage devices or in hard copy, would be still sitting on shelves, gathering dust and waiting for my demise, and waiting to the time I'm up on that great archive in the sky researching. I would still be at home sowing my early vegetables, stroking my dog, cutting my lawn, tormenting my wife and telling her not to move the bits of paper off the table that I'm working with, and thanks to Eleanor as well for putting up with me while doing this work. But again, we would not be here in this wonderful, wonderful part of the world. Tom, thanks very much for making Shoeboxes possible, number one, and number two, for planning this tour of duty in Canada, where we were able to retrace the steps of our Wicklow kinfolk through Peterborough, Smiths Falls, Tweed here, and all the other places that we
Well,
visited.
that's nice, Kevin, and thanks for that, but the reality is, for 30 years, he's been taking all of us, showing up on his doorstep, and showing us where we're from. So thank you for doing that for us. Literally Canadians, we just show up on his doorstep.
I remember over the last 30 years, the late parish priest in Carnew, part of Sean McCarthy, he had the way of copping out when you Canadians would come looking for your roots in Wicklow and Carnew and in Haley. He'd ramble over from the parochial house to my office in the school, and he'd introduce this Canadian to me, and or else when I was on vacation, he'd arrive at the back door with me in tow, and he'd make a hasty retreat, and he'd say, "Oh, Kevin," he had this deep guttural voice, he'd say, "Kevin, you will be rewarded in heaven for your work." On this tour, and the wonderful places, the wonderful opportunities, the wonderful doors that Tom has opened, God has rewarded us for our work. Father Sean was right.
Well, I'll have you know, he's had a good Canadian time. We didn't just do meetings. We went up to my cottage near Gravenhurst, and the sap was running, so he had taffy and he had maple syrup. So he's had a good Canadian winter experience. So there you go. So maybe we could sign some books.
Yeah, so we can sign some books. Also, you'll see on the forms that we've got, what we're hoping to is get basic contact information from you.
And everyone has one. So
Yeah.
what we're after, please put your family name down. As many of them that you know of, and give us an email so we can contact you. Especially, you know, when we contact people through Ancestry.com, they think we're gonna sell them vacuum cleaners, right? So please give us your contact, or take that, and that gives you all the website information. If you don't want to buy a book, don't worry, we've put all the information you need on the website. Remember, we're not trying to sell books and what have you, but it's a great way to have a reference. Because the book gives you